With food prices reaching record highs throughout the world, lots of articles and news stories coming out about food riots. Riots over rising food prices and chronic unemployment spiraled out from Algeria's capital on Thursday, with youths torching government buildings and shouting, "Bring us sugar." Police helicopters circled over Algiers, stores closed early, security officers blocked off streets, and areas outside the city were swept up in the rampages. The U.S. Embassy issued a warning to Americans in Algeria to remain vigilant and avoid crowds. Police stations, car dealerships, and other buildings were set ablaze. Police with tear gas fired back at stone-throwing youths through the night. If you think this is an isolated incident, look at what happened a few months ago in China. After the school announced price increases for the food, thousands of students showed up in a very unpeaceful protest and trashed the school cafeteria. Staying with China, a stronger exchange rate is likely to be one of the tools China uses to curb inflation in the first quarter as Beijing tries to stem a flood of liquidity. Other measures to rein in soaring prices will include interest rate hikes and increasing the amount of money banks must keep in reserve. Whether looking at it in terms of limiting inflation or reducing internal and external imbalances, there is more room to adjust the yuan exchange rate in 2011 than in 2010. The article goes on to say, China maintains a tight grip on yuan exchange rates despite pleading last June to let the currency trade more freely against the dollar. Speaking of emerging economies, the group of 7 economies, G7, will be surpassed in size by the largest emerging markets in just over 2 decades as the financial crisis accelerates the shift of power in the global economy. The combined gross domestic product of the 7 biggest developing economies will exceed that of the G7, the world's largest industrial markets, in 2032 using projected market exchange rates. It then added that China will also overtake the US as the world's largest economy in that year as well. Fears of a sovereign debt default are manifest in Europe and will soon spread to Japan and the U.S. as governments struggle to control deficits, according to Citigroup economists led by former Bank of England policymaker. Despite the recent drama, we believe we have only seen the opening and second act, with the rest of the plot still evolving. There is absolutely no safe sovereign. The U.S. and Japan likely cannot continue to ignore the issues of physical sustainability. It's only a matter of time before the U.S. government can only fund itself through debt issuance at significantly higher interest rates. Speaking of interest rates, one of NIA's 2010 predictions comes to fruition just a few days late. NIA said that Paul Volcker, chairman of President Obama's Economic Recovery Advisory Board, could become frustrated with the Obama administration and resign in 2010. And so it is. Paul Volcker, at 83 years old, was kept out of discussions on how the President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board might function next or who its new members might be. Volcker had had rocky relations with the Obama's top economic staff from the start. Volcker was disappointed with the final version of the rule that bears his name, as it was watered down with lobbying by banks and members of Congress sympathetic to Wall Street's views, as well as some administration members in the bank's defense. People with knowledge of the talks said the same. Paul Volcker, as former chairman of the Federal Reserve, was responsible for getting our economy out of the inflationary crisis of the 70s by raising the federal funds rate to 20%. His resignation is a bad sign for those of us who don't like inflation. Speaking of inflation, oil prices rose past $92 per barrel on Monday to a 26-month high, and drivers in the USA could be paying as much as $3.75 a gallon for gas this spring, oil experts predict. Prices at the gas pump have inched up all year as the cost of crude oil neared $100 a barrel. On Christmas Day, the average nationwide price of self-service regular hit $3, a record for that day. By year's end, the average price reached $3.06. Prices creeping towards $4 a gallon could have dire consequences for some industries and slow the economic recovery, analysts say. What economic recovery, I say. Numerous reports showing up all over the place in a propagandized type fashion explaining how we must raise the debt ceiling. The Obama administration on Thursday told Congress the government is about to hit the $14.3 trillion debt ceiling and will need authority to borrow more. Raise debt limit to avoid national catastrophe. Treasury Secretary Timothy Geithner warned lawmakers Thursday that the national debt could hit the legal limit on borrowing as soon as March 31st. He urged quick action to avoid a government default that would spark catastrophic economic consequences that will last for decades. Remember, kids, never face the music and take responsibility for something today when you can push it off till tomorrow.
This advertisement has been paid for with tax dollars.
And now for proof that our economy is getting stronger. Anyone thinking Americans might be back to their free-spending ways got a reality check on Thursday as many mainstream retailers reported disappointing December sales. While some store chains were quick to cite the blizzard that hit the East Coast after Christmas, investors seemed more concerned that December sales showed that consumers have still not returned to spending habits seen before the financial crisis, and that they will continue to be frugal. Not having any money results in frugality. And people not shopping leads to shopping center vacancies climb as unemployment cuts U.S. retailer demand. Vacancies at U.S. neighborhood and community shopping centers climbed in the fourth quarter from a year earlier as unemployment lingered close to 10%. The vacancy rate at shopping centers rose to 10.9% from 10.6% a year earlier. And to follow the increasing trend, other currencies gain amid slow shift away from U.S. dollar. Recently released foreign exchange reserves data from the IMF appear negative for the dollar, but positive for the Canadian dollar, euro, and Japanese yen. The U.S. dollar accounted for 61.3% of allocated reserves as of the third quarter of 2010. That compares to 61.5% a year ago. The established trend to diversify away from the U.S. dollar continues, but without a real alternative, this is a very slow process. As we transition nicely into this article, Canadian bonds beat world. Returns in Canada's bond market exceeded the rest of the world in 2010, gaining the most in 5 years, and may outperform again this year amid record foreign purchases of the nation's fixed income securities. And just across the border, U.S. consumer bankruptcy filings rose 9% last year compared with 2009, reaching 1.53 million according to the American Bankruptcy Institute. In 2010, more individuals filed for bankruptcy than in any year since 2005, when Congress passed legislation making it more difficult for individuals to discharge debt under court protection. But all that news aside, don't worry about anything and just keep in mind, you're on the road to recovery.
Watch your head, Granny!
And make sure to visit NIA's newly launched blog on a daily basis, where you can find the most up-to-date news articles dealing with the economy and inflation. And make sure to check out one of the most recent shocking posts explaining how a big supermarket said all their vendors are passing along rising prices to them, and they'll have to raise all food prices by 3 to 14%.